So I'm really not a very good boyfriend because my girlfriend has been wanting to build a new kitchen table for over a year now. She bought these plywood remnants from a cabinet shop, and they've been sitting around the house. But finally, I'm going to put these things together and we're going to make this table. And this has to be a custom-made table because it has unusual proportions. The tabletop itself is going to be 37 inches wide by 55 inches long, and then it's going to sit 37 inches off the ground. And it's hard to find a table that's manufactured that way, so we're going to have to make our own. And this is also a unique table in that it's going to have rebar hairpin legs as well as a plywood top, but it's not any plywood top. It consists of a number of strips turned on their end and then glued together. So it will feature the striations or the end grain of the plywood. Kind of similar to like a butcher block table, but with plywood. So at this point, I've cut my plywood down to the width of the table, and now I'm cutting my strips. Then each of my strips are 1.5 inches thick because I want the table to be 1.5 inches thick when finally done. And all of these strips are going to be turned on end, and so each one of them represents the height or the thickness of the tabletop. So I've seen these plywood glue-up projects before, and I know that they have a tendency to sag if not supported underneath. So with that in mind, I was going to add an extra piece of wood going perpendicular to all these strips of wood on the underside of the table. So I dadoed out a groove on all of these strips on one side, and I was going to router out another groove on the other side and place 2 pieces of wood underneath on the bottom of the table. And with all of them dadoed out, I'm now coalescing them on the floor and getting ready to glue them all up. I've got some extra long pipe clamps here to help with this glue up. And ideally I'd have more than just 2, but that's what we got. Alright, so glue up is done on our board over here on a tabletop, and now it's time to scrape the glue off there. So in order to do that, I'm going to try a little trick, which is basically I got this guy, Harbor Freight, $4, and it is a pry bar, but I'm going to use this as a scraper, a glue scraper, by modifying it slightly. We're going to take this part here and we're going to grind this down to a nice little edge, and I'm going to use this to scrape the glue off the top of our table. So here I'm tapping in the extra reinforcement strip that I dadoed a groove for earlier, and later on off camera I'm going to, on the opposite side of the table, router in another groove and do the same thing with another strip of wood on that side. So there'll be 2 equally spaced pieces of wood on the bottom in the hopes that it will add extra strength to the tabletop and prevent it from sagging, which it didn't, by the way. And so now, because we bought the wrong type of plywood for this, basically this plywood is a cabinet grade plywood, which is very nice finish on the outside, but it does have voids on the inside of the plywood, little chip out things sort of here and there, and so the end grain is not the best. What we should have gotten was Baltic birch plywood. That has much better end grain. It's where it's solid all the way across, and it does not have these little voids in it. And as a result, what we're doing here at an added expense of time and money is filling these voids with epoxy. We did not gain anything by using this plywood. So lesson learned on this one. And in order to apply the epoxy and not have it drip out through the bottom of the table, we've taped up the top of the table and then started to apply the epoxy from the bottom of the table, so it will fill up the voids from the top to the bottom of the table. And so my girlfriend spent a couple of weeks filling this table with epoxy and letting it dry and then filling it again and trying to fill in these voids and then sanding the epoxy down off the top of the table and then finally sealing the table with water locks to make it water resistant and give it that nice little shine. So there's a completely separate and highly detailed video on making the hairpin table legs for this table, and those I made them out of rebar, and in order to make the legs I made a couple of fixtures that allowed me to make these legs in a more standardized way. That's all in a separate video, which I'll link in the description of this video if you want to check that out. I am continuing my work on this plywood tabletop We've got the hairpin legs already made, and now it's time to attach these two together. In order to do that, I'm actually going to make a metal frame for the bottom of this. I'm going to make that metal frame out of some 1-inch square tubing. Alright, so we've now got everything cut and the ends cleaned up for welding. Now it's time to break out our little welding fixtures here for our corners. Alright, and now I'm using a speed square to mark the 45-degree angles on those flat stock for the corner braces. And then I'm going to cut that out with an angle grinder, and then we'll weld that into the corners. Alright, so I want to be able to set this leg on to the frame approximately like so that the forces are transmitted from the tabletop to the frame, and then directly from the frame to the leg, and then down to the ground. Then the little holes here will line up with this piece right here. I'll go ahead and mark those holes, drill them out, and then on the back side I'll weld in a nut so that I can then thread these guys directly onto the frame like that.